Welcome to this open Cambridge event, Porridge and Polar Bears, the Cambridge Svalbard Exploration Archive. I'm Sandra Freshney and I'm the archivist at the Sedgwick Museum of Earth Sciences, University of Cambridge. We hope that the talk today will give you an interesting insight into some of the records of the Cambridge Svalbard Exploration Archive, those we have been uncovering whilst listing and repackaging the records. There is still a lot of work to do, so this is really just scratching the surface. So this evening we'll be looking at a variety of topics, some in more detail than others, a bit of a rummage through the archive. We'll be looking at the role of Brian Harland. We'll be looking at the collections, the geology, the data, equipment, boats, and of course, the theme for Heritage Open Days and Open Cambridge is Edible England. So we'll be looking at the importance of food and drink for the expedition teams. And we'll briefly touch upon how we've been preserving the records and making the collections available to researchers. Svalbard, previously known as Spitsbergen, is located in the northwestern corner of the Barents Shelf area, 650 kilometres north of Norway, and is named after the Dutch navigator, cartographer, and Arctic explorer William Barents, who is credited with the modern discovery of the islands in 1596, and after whom the Barents Sea is named. The Svalbard Treaty of 1920 recognised Norwegian sovereignty. Spitsbergen, previously known as West Spitsbergen, is the largest and only permanently populated island of the Svalbard archipelago. It is a largely ice cap and glaciers. Svalbard has a long record of geological history that provides essential evidence for all theories of Arctic evolution. Cambridge University has been sending scientific expeditions to Spitsbergen since 1938 to study the geology and map the area. In 1938, the six-man team led by Mr. L.H. McCabe spent 4 weeks examining geology and geomorphology, which is the study of landforms, their processes, form and sediments at the surface of the Earth. The trip was quite difficult. There were severe shortages of food and very bad weather. One member of the party was 21-year-old Brian Harland, who you can see here seated at the table, just second from the right-hand side. Here is Brian in 1938 at a field base and some other locations. This trip was to have a massive influence on Brian, not least of all the importance of organised expeditions with excellent record keeping, which we'll come back to shortly. Walter Brian Harland, known throughout his life as Brian, was born in Scarborough in 1917 and educated at Bootham School in York before heading up to Gonville and Caius College, Cambridge, where he graduated in geological sciences. When Brian was 13, he discovered a fossil marine crocodile, the Steniosaurus, which now resides at the Natural History Museum in London. So we can argue that this was quite an incredible start to what would be a brilliant career, not only as a geologist, but also as an administrator and teacher. Brian's PhD to investigate the deep structure of Eastern England using explosion seismology was interrupted as a result of the Second World War. As a Quaker and conscientious objector, Brian subsequently spent time on a farm before teaching in China, which also had a big impact on his life, not least of all his friendship with Joseph Needham, the chemist and historian of Chinese science. Brian returned to Cambridge in 1946, becoming a demonstrator, lecturer and reader in the Department of Geology, later the Department of Earth Sciences. He was an enthusiastic teacher and enjoyed taking students to the Isle of Arran for their field trips to study Scottish geology, which he did for more than 30 years, leading some 2,000 students in total. And first year students still visit Arran for 7 days to investigate sediments that document Britain's northwest drift across the equator over the last 400 million years, and to simply experience geology at scale, gigantic millipede tracks in Carboniferous forests, the deserts of the Permian, and the volcanism of the last 60 million years. So Brian's first trip to Svalbard sparked his interest in the region, and so began a lifelong research program, initially called the Cambridge Spitsbergen Expedition Program, to better understand the geology of the region, and as Brian himself wrote, to try out a pattern of cooperation research with our students. Brian led or coordinated over 40 expeditions from 1948 to 1993 with the help of over 350 undergraduate students, research students, and postdoctoral researchers. From this work, there were at least 250 geological publications and around 30 PhDs. It was an excellent training ground for future geologists. And the work eventually became the Cambridge Arctic Shelf Programme, CASP, which was established in 1975 as a scientific research company and charity carrying out field work in remote locations. Brian didn't achieve this by himself, of course, and I just want to mention Brian's wife, Elizabeth, at this point. Elizabeth accompanied Brian on 13 expeditions to Svalbard and was awarded a Polar Medal for her services in 1998. Elizabeth was born in Wales and read history at Girton College, Cambridge. She married Brian in 1942 and they had 4 children and lived in Grantchester Meadows here in Cambridge. Elizabeth became a councillor in a county council by-election as an independent in 1964 until 1973. Later, she became first chair of the Community Health Council and was awarded an OBE for services to the community. So let's take a look at the collections. One physical result of the expeditions to Svalbard are an incredible reference collection of geological specimens. There are about 60,000 objects in 1,800 wooden drawers, which you can see here on the left, with a diagram of the original labels. The collection includes igneous and metamorphic rocks, including some fossils and minerals, core material from boreholes, and 4,500 thin sections, which are thin slices of rocks, minerals, or soil prepared in a lab. In 2012, a major reorganisation was completed and the collection was rearranged by year of acquisition and then by alphanumeric sequence. Since 2019, the collection has been stored in the new Collections Research Centre of the Sedgwick Museum called the Colin Forbes Building, named after former museum curator and Svalbard attendee in 1949. Here is Colin in 1949 in Svalbard. The specimen collection is supported with an incredible archive, which we're going to take a look at in a bit more detail. Brian knew early on about the importance of records, as you can see here from this quote in a bulletin that was sent to students in 1953, reinforcing this, how important the records were and how necessary it was to keep original field notebooks and other material for continued research. The archive, which I currently estimate comprises over 500 archive boxes, contains all the original field notebooks, which is about 400, expedition notes and catalogues of specimens, the stations visited and photographs taken, which forms the main part of the archive, as well as administrative records, including correspondence and finance records, equipment records, including brochures and samples, maps and plans, photographs, over 2,000 slides and 16,000 negatives, although there's probably another 5,000 negatives, as we've just discovered another wooden chest full of negatives from Svalbard. Much of this material includes far more information than has previously been published about the expeditions or the work that was undertaken. Other records that we're going to briefly refer to today are those of 2 students, Philip Martin and Charles Stileman. Philip, who you can see here on the left, was a student in the early 1950s and attended the 1951 expedition, which was run jointly with Oxford. And he was an assistant geologist. He deposited his diary with us a few years ago. Charles Stileman was also a student in the early 1950s and attended the 1952 expedition as the geologist. He wrote his memoirs up a few years ago for his family and kindly presented a copy to the museum. So the expeditions, these were essentially a regular program of systematic geological and stratigraphic investigations. The expeditions averaged about 9 members divided into 3-person project parties, each led by a graduate research geologist with mainly undergraduate assistants. Brian issued a series of bulletins to members before each expedition, and this ensured everyone was up to speed with essential information and practical arrangements. And you can see an example here on the left where Brian is talking about notebooks, numbers, initials, and samples. The principles for fieldwork note-taking were devised at this trip in 1949, and these included a very distinct system for specimen numbers, which were always underlined. They were usually written with Indian ink on strips of surgical tape and stuck directly onto a specimen or a bag of specimens. Station numbers were always ringed in notebooks and in round parentheses in typescript. Observed points were put in triangles, and photograph numbers were identified in rectangles in notebooks and square brackets in typescript. Each member each year was allocated a letter of the alphabet. This was used both as identification of personal baggage and as a prefix for station, specimens, and photo numbers. Each year, the starting number of these was given to the member. This system was maintained throughout the expeditions, and we have lists of these in the archive. According to Brian, writing in 1949, different members were made responsible for the writing of diaries and reports and for the curating of records and specimens in different departments of work, so that current results were readily available during the expedition. Here we can see an example of a field notebook. This one belonged to Peter Friend, who you can see here. Peter attended 7 expeditions to Svalbard after graduating from Gonville and Keys College, and also attended a further 3 to East Greenland. Peter was awarded the Polar Medal in 2015, recognising his contribution of our knowledge of the polar regions. He is currently chairman of the Friends of the Sedgwick Museum. And we'll hear from Peter later on in a short snippet from an oral history interview we conducted a few years ago. This notebook is one of Brian's from 1953. This expedition consisted of 8 members who were in the field for 6 weeks, and its aim was to consolidate on previous work and complete outstanding geological and topographical problems which had engaged the 1949 expedition team. This slide shows you examples of the catalogues that were kept about the stations visited, specimens collected, and photographs taken. They are often quite comprehensive and provide us with a lot of data. Some of this data was later transferred to individual sheets, index cards, and of course, eventually an electronic catalogue. One student to mention at this point is Jonathan Cutbill. Here is Jonathan on the left here, who was leader of Party E, and they were measuring sections of the northern Spitsbergen rocks. Jonathan also worked with Brian, who developed something called georecords, a system where pieces of information were regarded as standard units that could be preserved and handled in a standardized way. Jonathan was also documentation pioneer at the Sedgwick Museum. You can see his work here from 1973, which was sent to Brian. He was also co-founder of Gaze the Word Bookshop in London. And the Sedgwick Museum recently added a new interpretive label and photo of John Cutbill in the museum. And this is our first LGBT content on display, building on University of Cambridge Museum projects, which aim to diversify the voices within our museums. We actually found these original rock labels recently in a large wooden chest of negatives in a number of tins and boxes, including a typewriter ribbon tin. You can see the pink surgical tape in the middle used for labelling specimens. Briefly touching upon mapping, here the expedition team are discussing the upcoming expedition, and the Woodwardian professor, William Bernard Robinson King, who had been awarded an OBE and MBE during the World Wars, is also in the room. on the right-hand side of this photo, as well as expedition members and Brian himself, who's standing looking over the map. In the beginning, maps didn't exist for the areas that the teams were working in. In a report written in 1970 by Alison Reynolds, who attended 2 Svalbard excursions in 1969 and 1975, states, work was hampered by a lack of published maps, and workers had to compile their own from published papers, hydrographic charts, oblique air photographs, and their own field observations. However, there were major changes in the 1960s when grants from government research funds and the oil industry became a reality. There were larger expedition groups and more people to undertake the mapping. Ailsa reports that a collection of several hundred original maps, topographical, geological, structural, have been drawn, and a large number of stratigraphical sections, both horizontal and vertical, have been constructed. The archive includes this incredible work. We have annotated maps, topographical, geological, structural, of Svalbard, with details of localities visited and specimens collected. This is one of Brian's from 1949, which isn't very clear here, but he has marked on here some of the specimens that he's collected, as well as printed maps and those published by expedition members in later journals. There was, of course, an awful lot of equipment to take to Svalbard: boat engines, motorboats, radio, echo chambers, echo sounders, drilling equipment, skidoos, and of course, camping items such as tents, sledges, skis, and crampons. Members of the expeditions would also have had access to measuring equipment, binoculars, and cameras. Here are some images from 1949 with boxes of equipment, including boat propellers, being delivered to the Downing Street site, and a room or lab in the department being used to store boxes before they were driven up to Newcastle. Here we have some clothing and equipment in 1938. This, of course, is Brian's first trip to Svalbard for his studies. And you can see that he's included a whistle, hankies, and of course, a pouch for snacks and other food. And you can see Brian here, second from the left, pretty much wearing what he's drawn in this particular sketch. And here's some early PPE from a metal trunk of Brian's that we've recently unpacked. Charles Steinman records in his diary for 1952, I received no equipment apart from a pair of ex-army skis and an old worn-out sleeping bag lent by the Scott Polar Institute with no pocketing to keep feathers in place. Unlike today's explorers equipped with specialised polar clothing, I wore flannel trousers, old pullovers, an ex-War Department anorak, woolen gloves and army boots. But I did wear a beautifully warm fur trapper's hat, given to me generously by a man I met in Longyearbyen, who could not be sure that he would ever see it again. And here we have another sketch from 1969 from the Norse Cambridge expedition. Doesn't look very different in terms of clothing, although probably much warmer and safer, but you can see a helicopter in the background. So some things have certainly changed by this point. A few years ago, the family of Brian kindly got in touch saying they had some old film from 1949 and 1953 taken in Svalbard. There are 4 film reels ranging from between 6 and 18 minutes long. They were very generously had these digitized for the archive. In this clip, you can see some of the team crossing melt streams in the lower part of the Mittag Leffelbreen Glacier. Brian is taking the footage whilst his colleagues Mike Bailey and Pat Parks are doing all the hard work. And you can see pictures of Mike, Pat and Brian to the right-hand side on the boat as they're travelling over to Svalbard. Clearly, health and safety was not much of a concern at this point. The team were also there with a physiological team from the university and assisted them with their studies. And yes, the yellow fluid is probably what you think it is. Charles Steinman talks about skiing and sledging. Very few of us had skied before. When hauling sledges, skiing was no problem, but without the sledge, we were at a loss. We had to learn to ski by bitter experience, and my method of stopping was to fall over. On glacier ice, this was painful and could be dangerous. However, after being free of the sledge, it was a great relief to ski with long cross-country strides. And at this point, I just want to say that aside from the students themselves, there are so many others who had an important role to play in these expeditions. One such person is a lady called Phoebe Edmiston, who undertook administrative work for the very first couple of expeditions and also in the department whilst Brian was away. Brian writes a very heartfelt thank you to Phoebe's father, a doctor who had provided medical advice for the expedition after the first trip. We owe more to her than any other member of the team, as she had the most thankless jobs which had to be done and couldn't be done without her. And in the notebook of student Philip Martin, there are copies of telegrams from Phoebe. So she was clearly keeping in close contact with the family of those who had gone to Svalbard. I don't have much time to talk about all the huts that were used in the expeditions, but suffice to say, they varied in quality and resources. Here you can see Peter Friend's assessment in the late 1950s, a note at the back of his field notebook, commenting especially about water supply. In a postcard to Elizabeth Harland in 1971, Brian writes, "Our hut is marked X. I hope it will be standing still at the end of the expedition, as it is threatened with demolition, as are others." Due to Svalbard's geographic isolation, reliable, hardy, seafaring transportation was vital to the execution of an expedition at this location. Tremendous time and effort went into the acquisition, repair, storage, design, transit, and stocking of these vessels. And there is hundreds of correspondences with boat vendors, parts dealers, mechanics, and storehouse owners. Accompanying them are detailed boat plans, inventories, repair logs, engine manuals, leaflets for safety, electronic and navigational equipment, and hundreds of photographs of the interiors and exteriors of the boats. Here are just a small selection of plans and sketches. The boat called Saltarella is named after a small shelly fossil, and this was used during the 1960s. And a nice colour photograph of it in use. The group also used Norwegian vessels, including the Kvitfisk, and here's a sketch of this in one of Brian's notebooks, as well as the Copious. And here we've got sketches in Brian notebooks, as well as more technical plans and a colour postcard too. So the theme for Heritage Open Days and Open Cambridge is, of course, Edible England. So let us now turn to food and drink consumed in Svalbard. I'm just going to play you a brief section from an oral history interview with Dr. Peter Friend, who's talking about packaging up supplies for Svalbard and what this actually entailed.
We would arrive usually in late June, having got ourselves organised and packed all our food and things, food and tents and so on, all had to be packed and organised in Cambridge. Especially I remember we used to take over one of the labs in the department, and we used to order up food from various suppliers, many of whom in those days would supply it free of charge because we were an expedition. And then we would pack it all up into standard boxes, which were based on the sledging rations that and those in turn were based on the experiences of people like the Scott expeditions and so on, way back in the heroic days of polar exploration. So we had food boxes which contained enough food for one person for 16 days, or 16 people for one day. So we had to do all that, and we arranged it all. We drove it up to Newcastle in a hard van, and then it was shipped up with us all the way up the Norwegian coast, across from North Norway to Spitsbergen, and the whole of that journey would probably take about 10 days, that sort of thing. But it was really enjoyable because it's a very spectacular coastline and journey. And of course, arriving in Spitsbergen, it really was quite spectacular. I mean, there were many very large glaciers and things like that, which you could see on the coast of Spitsbergen as you were sailing up there.
Here we have a company brochure for Reed Corrugated Cases Limited in 1959-60 about the packing cases which the expedition were using for food. And Brian reports back to the company saying, "We were delighted with the behaviour of the cases. We used them as containers for our standard 16-man day sets of rations, each weighing about 30 pounds. The food was largely tinned, and the cases stood up to an internal hammering from the tins remarkably well. We used the boxes on pack frames on sledges and in small boats when they had to contend with all the conditions of wetness and rough treatment. They stood up to this better than any of us considered that corrugated board could. We were very much impressed." Here is an image from 1949 with a series of the cases all stacked up and ready to go to Svalbard. And we're very lucky to have an example of one of these boxes in the archive. Looking at the box lists we have for the administrative files, thanks to a number of volunteers working on the archive over the years, we can see that Brian corresponded with many businesses asking for support and assistance. And there are also excellent records about what was taken and eaten whilst they were away. Here is Brian's food list for 1938 with columns for how much they took and what looks like a tally chart for how much was actually opened or consumed. And the priority right at the top, the dog biscuits, of course. You can also see something towards the bottom called pemmican. This is historically an important part of indigenous cuisine in certain parts of North America. It was usually a mixture of dried meat and sometimes berries. It's a very calorific, rich food and has been used for Arctic and Antarctic exploration for some time. So it was equally suited to be used in Svalbard too. Here we have a shopping list for 1949 sent to one company requesting quite specific brands of food. This one includes 12 pounds of Christmas puddings, perhaps a little strange as they were not there over Christmas time, but it would have been very filling and certainly a real treat, of course. Companies approached by Brian included all the big names that we may still be familiar with now, such as Cadbury's, Nestle, Heinz, Tate & Lyle, Cowingate, McVitie's, Cars of Carlisle, Batchelors, Bovril, McDougall's, Cross & Blackwell, Rowntree's and Thai Food Tea, but also companies which have been taken over by larger organisations. And one of my personal favourites, BB Biscuits, which was a company in Blackpool. They were approached in 1949, but Brian is informed that biscuits are still a rationed commodity and we can only supply you with £100 by robbing the civilian population unless you get permission, etc., etc. Suffice to say, Brian didn't get permission and they went without their BB biscuits. Charles Starman recalls food during the 1952 expedition. At breakfast, I added margarine as well as sugar to my porridge, and at supper, I added sugar to my pemmican. Under present conditions, the pemmican was quite palatable, whereas at home, it would be revolting. Each sledge party would stop for lunch when sledging and eat cheese, ship's biscuits, and chocolate. The hard biscuits were important as we needed something hard to bite on. We particularly enjoyed the chocolate because at home, we were allowed only a small wartime ration. We were always hungry, even after a meal, and were prepared to eat food off the tent floor or use a spoon licked by someone else. Being a very slow eater, I was unpopular with the others because they had to watch me eating when they had finished. And of course, porridge. Here we have an invoice from A&R Scott, which was a company in Glasgow, for the Scott's porridge oats. It has a very distinctive name, which they adopted in 1914. The company was, of course, later acquired by Quaker in the 1980s. You can see from the invoice that the oats were actually free. And as Peter Friend says in the clip you just heard, this was often the case. There are letters from Brian during the early expeditions saying, "We have no funds at all and are quite unable to support the burden ourselves." Here is Brian's letter to the company once they returned, and clearly the oats were a great success, as you can see. It was one of our most popular items of food, Brian says. Here is an article in Keir Ora's company magazine, Marble Archer. And the expedition party used the soft drink to make the melted snow more palatable for drinking, as well as using it on the journeys back to Norway. Here we have an article from a staff magazine for Tate and Lyle. The expedition party had about 4 ounces of sugar per day, slightly less if they were at base camp. Brian wrote to the company on their return saying, "I want to let you know how useful the sugar was on the expedition. It has become an uncontested fact now that nothing in the Tate and Lyle consignment is ever thrown away or gets wasted." And they used the tins for food on the way out and rock samples and photographic film on the way home. And here is an empty sugar bag that we found recently in a large metal tin. Here we have a list of food for a 12-day man tent box in the late 1960s. Porridge makes an appearance again, as does Cadbury's chocolate and drinking chocolate too. Talking of chocolate, here is a note in a field notebook from the early 1970s about the size of chocolate bars and wanting 2 smaller bars rather than the larger 5p bar because, and I should think most of us can relate to this, several of us found it difficult to leave an open bar alone, those still wrapped being less of a temptation. It's quite fascinating to learn more about the diet of those on expeditions and the brands that they liked and those companies which offered reduced prices or even free goods. There's probably a lot to unpick here in terms of the history of some of these foods and the companies themselves, and this would certainly make a fascinating research project. The explorations in Svalbard, especially in the early decades, presented many challenges, technical, physical, and financial. Brian Harland broke his ankle on one expedition as a sledge crashed through a snow bridge over a crevasse and dragged all 5 members of the team down 12 meters, although Brian continued to ski on it. In a hazards and precautions checklist from 1974, Brian warns the group about potential fires, reporting that one party in 1959 burnt down a hut through allowing the stove to burn too fiercely. The roof smouldered and later burst into flames. A paraffin can added to the destruction. And the record certainly reflects some of these challenges, from telegrams charting logistical problems to details of illness, especially sickness from travel or food, and sadly, in one case, death. In his preface to his published account of the geology of Svalbard, Brian writes, "A brilliant first-year student was killed in 1958 by a flying stone while holding a fossil at a new locality on a mountain later named after him. A service was held in 1959 at his remote grave, and memorial cairns were built nearby and by the shoreside base. He represents the best of our university tradition." And now on to polar bears. Charles Starman reports that at least in 1952, fortunately, we never met one, except the stuffed one outside our hotel in Tromsø. And unlike today's travellers, we did not carry a rifle. In fact, the thought of the risk of meeting one never crossed our minds. Today, with the melting of the ice, it is common for polar bears to come on land. And in 1974, Brian writes, bears have been seldom known to attack men, and I'm more anxious about accidents due to mishandling firearms. Bears near a permanent camp may have to be shot as they represent a continuing threat to safety of food, tent, and life. A wounded bear may be very nasty. Small pencil very lights, if available, should be fired to scare the bear. From 1870 to 2014, there were 73 attacks by wild polar bears distributed among all 5 polar bear range states, which resulted in 20 human fatalities and 63 human injuries. In the archive, there are about 2,000 slides in the collection, including these of polar bears getting a little bit too close for comfort in 1977. In the Polar Record, which is the official account of the expedition, it says polar bears were sighted in Hornsund. One even boarded Saltarella, and it seems that an unusually large number were present on Spitsbergen this summer. This was in large measure due to the persistence of fjord ice, but may also reflect the fact that 5 years have now elapsed since the hunting of bears was banned in Svalbard. And now we're very briefly going to look at preservation and access to the collections. Preservation is basically our attempts to try and slow down the deterioration in collections and extend the record's useful life so we can ensure continued availability for years to come. Paper is quite weak and vulnerable to attack, and records will and do deteriorate, making access difficult or sometimes impossible. The main issues in the Svalbard archive are rust and corrosion, acidification, so brittle records in some cases, and the odd bit of water damage. We've used conservation grade materials to repackage the collection and provide some protection. In 2011, a small collections care grant from Renaissance East of England was awarded to the museum to repackage some of the records into conservation grade boxes. One issue which was apparent early on were some diagrams which were spread throughout the expedition files for the 1950s. We guessed that they were sketched onto a material called ethulon, a type of acetate. Despite claims in an advert that it does not discolor or become brittle with age, it has certainly been affected by changes in temperature and storage conditions. We were fortunate to have some engineering students from Johns Hopkins University look at the material using a variety of scientific techniques for a research project. They confirmed that it was most likely to be a form of ethyl cellulose, their tests showing that the material didn't dissolve in water, but was prone to shrinking. So, ideal for use in Arctic conditions, but not so great being stored back in the UK. One of our archive volunteers, Cherry, steadfastly pieced the diagrams loosely back together in between sheets of Melanex and inert polyester. This enabled them to then be photographed to ensure that at least the data was not lost. The original diagrams are sadly beyond repair, but will continue to be stored in the archive. Another issue we discovered were negatives in red expedition binders. In 2017, a small amount of funding was awarded from the Arts Council England PRISM Fund, the Preservation of Industrial and Scientific Material. This enabled the museum to purchase bespoke polyester sleeves to repackage 16,000 negatives in the archive. And here you can see the before and after images, and also a small display about the project, also a selection of digitized negatives from Brian's particular collection, and we hope that we can digitize the entire negative collection at some point in the future. In terms of access, we have done some preliminary box and file listing and cataloguing some sections of the archive according to international archive standards. And you can see an introduction to all of this online on the Archives Hub, which is a fantastic resource for searching catalogues of archival collections across the UK. And we will also be adding data to Archive Search, which is a Cambridge-based platform providing access to finding aids in the city. We have had a number of visitors to look at the collection, academics interested in localities from the 1960s, looking at field notebooks, those investigating their family history or who were on expeditions themselves, and students doing research projects, including history and philosophy of science student looking at 1950s expedition photography. And we hope to encourage many more researchers to come and use this remarkable collection. The archive provides us with a unique glimpse into the lives of the participants and the meticulous planning involved in launching geological expeditions to Svalbard, as well as being an integral and absolutely invaluable part of the specimen collection. I hope this talk has been of some interest. Thank you so much for joining me, and if you have any burning questions, please do get in touch or follow me on Twitter. Many thanks for joining me today. Thank you.